What if I told you Henry VIII changed England's law for the first time in history, just to legally kill a woman who'd lost her mind? In the dark chronicles of Tudor history, few events embody the ruthless extremes of royal power, and the terrifying intersection of mental breakdown and absolute monarchy, like the execution of Jane Boleyn, Viscountess Rowford, on February 13, 1542, a single act that stands among the most shocking royal scandals ever recorded in dark history, and which still casts shadows over the Tower of London today. For what makes Jane's execution truly horrifying isn't merely the bloody swing of the executioner's axe, but the unprecedented legal manipulation orchestrated personally by King Henry VIII, who shattered centuries of English jurisprudence solely to eliminate one woman who, consumed by the trauma of treachery and betrayal at the heart of the Tudor court, suffered a devastating mental collapse behind the forbidding walls of the Tower. It was the first time in England's storied legal history that Parliament rewrote the law to make it permissible to execute someone judged insane, an extraordinary twist in the saga of Henry VIII, a monarch already infamous for severing ties with Rome, decapitating queens like Anne Boleyn, and wielding the machinery of royal justice with merciless precision. Yet Jane Boleyn's story resonates with a unique, chilling irony, because the very woman who may have played a role in orchestrating the downfall of her own husband, George Boleyn, and sister-in-law, Anne Boleyn, would herself stand condemned and die beneath the same gray stones, in the same haunted fortress, under eerily similar accusations of treason, revealing not merely the paranoia of a tyrant king, but the tragic vulnerability of anyone, especially women, caught within the shifting tides of royal favor, secrets, and vengeance. And as you're about to discover, Jane Boleyn's final days reveal how far Henry VIII was willing to bend, break, and completely redefine the laws of England to protect his power and his secrets, proving that in the deadly corridors of Tudor power, even madness offered no salvation. Jane Parker, born around 1505 into the ambitious Parker family of Norfolk, entered the labyrinthine world of the Tudor court already burdened with both the privileges and perils that came from being a noblewoman during one of England's most volatile periods, and from an early age, under the stern yet scholarly guidance of her father, Henry Parker, 10th Baron Morley, a man known throughout Tudor history for his intellectual pursuits as a translator and courtier. Jane absorbed not only the languages and refinements expected of noble daughters, but also the silent codes of survival and political intuition that defined life under the ever-watchful eyes of the royal court. Because in the corridors of Henry VIII's palaces, knowledge could be a weapon, and silence could be the only shield between life and a traitor's scaffold, and it was this dangerous duality that would shape Jane into one of the most fascinating and ultimately doomed figures of dark history. As her marriage around 1524 to George Boleyn, brother of Anne Boleyn, the future queen whose story remains one of the most famous royal scandals ever whispered behind the cold stones of the Tower of London, catapulted her directly into the epicenter of royal secrets and political turbulence, where every glance, every whispered conversation, and every loyalty could mean the difference between a life of privilege and a brutal fall from grace, because Henry VIII's England was not merely a kingdom, but a living, breathing game of power, where alliances shifted like quicksand, and where even the high-born could lose their heads, quite literally, should they miscalculate a single step. And for Jane, the stakes were unimaginably high, for as the wife of George Boleyn, she was instantly swept into the meteoric rise of the Boleyn family, who, fueled by Anne Boleyn's bewitching hold over the king, ascended to breathtaking heights of influence and proximity to the throne. But such dizzying power came with shadows, as every courtier knew that Henry VIII's passion could turn to murderous fury in an instant, a reality Jane witnessed firsthand as a lady-in-waiting to Anne, a position that offered her unprecedented access to the private chambers, hushed confidences, and forbidden conversations of the Tudor court, making her simultaneously invisible and indispensable, a silent observer of secrets that, if spoken aloud, could bring down queens and reshape England's destiny. And it was this role that turned Jane into a figure of both admiration and suspicion. For those who knew her spoke of a woman whose eyes missed nothing, whose demeanor masked a calculating mind, and whose instincts for reading the political winds rivaled even the most seasoned courtiers. placing her in the rare position of surviving through the reigns of 4 different queens, a feat that in itself speaks volumes about the perilous tightrope she walked daily. Where one slip could lead to an accusation of treason or worse, yet Jane's brilliance and adaptability, the very traits that allowed her to navigate the treacherous waters of Henry VIII's ever-changing marital and political alliances, also painted her as dangerous. For in a realm consumed by paranoia, a woman who knew too many royal secrets was a threat that even kings could not ignore, and the England in which Jane maneuvered was a nation seething with religious upheaval, where Henry's break from Rome unleashed a maelstrom of Protestant and Catholic conflict, each faction vying for influence, sowing suspicion and betrayal in equal measure, creating a court atmosphere so tense that a misplaced word could summon the executioner. And for Jane, who stood at the crossroads of royal marriages, religious reform, and political conspiracy, the burden of knowledge grew heavier with each passing year, ultimately placing her in the unique position of possessing secrets that could shatter the fragile balance of power surrounding the king. Secrets that would become the very reason Henry VIII could never allow her to live once her mental state began to fracture. For in the shadowy world of Tudor history and true crime history alike, Jane Boleyn's life serves as a chilling testament to how swiftly favor could turn to mortal danger, and how even the sharpest mind could become ensnared in a web of royal scandals so dark that it could only end in blood. And as we peel back the layers of her entanglements within the Boleyn family, one truth emerges with terrifying clarity. Her intimate connection to Anne Boleyn would become both her greatest asset and the seed of her ultimate destruction, leading us directly into the deadly spiral that began the moment Jane stepped into the Queen's inner circle. Within the charged air of the Tudor court, where every glance might conceal ambition and every whisper could carry lethal weight, Jane Boleyn's relationship with her sister-in-law Anne Boleyn blossomed and darkened in a way that still electrifies historians and lovers of true crime history alike, for as lady-in-waiting to Anne, Jane stood closer than almost anyone to the pulse of royal power, observing firsthand the meteoric rise of a woman whose very name, Anne Boleyn, has become synonymous with both passion and ruin in the chronicles of Tudor history. And in those gilded halls where Henry VIII's gaze could transform courtiers into nobles or traitors overnight, Jane watched Anne's transformation from an enchanting courtier whose magnetism ensnared the king and shattered England's bond with Rome, into a beleaguered queen whose inability to produce a male heir fanned Henry's growing fury, and whose sharp tongue and political involvement bred dangerous enemies eager for her downfall. And as the flames of suspicion and religious conflict burned ever hotter around Anne, Jane Boleyn occupied a role both privileged and perilous. Forced to navigate the treacherous dance of unwavering loyalty to her mistress, while also ensuring her own survival in a court where alliances crumbled with terrifying speed. For in a realm defined by royal scandals and dark history, even a moment of hesitation or a single miscalculated confession could spell doom. And though some historians speculate that Jane may have felt genuine loyalty and even sympathy toward Anne, there exists a shadow of intrigue suggesting that Jane's meticulous observations and political acumen might have driven her to make the ultimate sacrifice of kinship to secure her own life. Because as accusations swirled in 1536 around Anne Boleyn's alleged adultery, and even the scandalous rumor of incest with her own brother George Boleyn, a charge so monstrous it still reverberates through dark history documentaries and YouTube explorations of royal secrets, Jane Boleyn's testimony emerged as a devastating weapon for the crown, her words allegedly lending credence to suspicions that Anne and George shared conversations of such inappropriate intimacy that they could be twisted into evidence of treasonous incest. And whether Jane truly believed these allegations, or whether her statements were wrenched from her under pressure from Henry VIII's relentless agents, remains one of the most fiercely debated mysteries in Tudor history, fueling endless debates among historians and true crime enthusiasts who continue to ask, was Jane Boleyn a calculating betrayer, or merely another victim ensnared in the lethal politics of a king determined to erase every trace of his own scandal? For her words helped seal the fate of both Anne and George, condemning them to the scaffold upon Tower Hill, where the crowd watched two of the Boleyn dynasty's brightest stars fall in blood and steel. And in that moment, Jane Boleyn's life forked along a perilous new path, as she became simultaneously the widow of a man executed for treason and the woman who might have helped deliver him to death. Yet paradoxically, she remained indispensable to Henry VIII, precisely because of the secrets she held, and though she survived the purges that obliterated the Boleyn faction, the psychological cost was incalculable, for in the quiet corridors of the Tower of London, where ghosts of the condemned seemed to linger, Jane carried the crushing weight of knowing her own testimony might have destroyed both her husband and her queen, leaving her haunted by guilt, terror, and the constant fear that the same fate awaited her. And it is precisely this unbearable burden of knowledge and survivor's guilt that would follow Jane like a spectral shadow into the next phase of her life, when she would be forced to reinvent herself amid new royal marriages and shifting political currents, a chapter we now step into as we explore how Jane Boleyn, newly widowed and tainted by scandal, struggled to navigate the treacherous aftermath of the Boleyn downfall and carve out a fragile existence in the ever-changing storm of Henry VIII's unforgiving court. In the stormy wake of the Boleyn executions in 1536, when the dust of Tower Hill had barely settled and the blood of Anne and George still seemed to stain the stones of London's most feared fortress, Jane Boleyn found herself adrift in a kingdom where survival depended on erasing one's past almost as quickly as the king changed wives. For though she was now a widow tainted by association with a family condemned for treason, she paradoxically became even more valuable to Henry VIII, precisely because of the dark secrets she carried about the inner workings of his former marriage to Anne Boleyn, secrets that could have ignited fresh scandal in a court already suffocating under rumors and fear. And so, in a dazzling display of political agility that remains one of the most remarkable feats in Tudor history, Jane Boleyn remade herself into an indispensable presence in the royal household, quietly transferring her loyalty first to Jane Seymour, the gentle queen whose brief reign was defined by her successful delivery of the long-awaited male heir, Prince Edward, and whose death plunged the king into genuine mourning, though even in grief, Henry's mind never strayed far from the necessities of royal power, and Jane Boleyn, ever attuned to the subtleties of court life, understood that survival demanded absolute discretion, careful alliances, and an unflinching readiness to serve whichever queen happened to occupy the throne. For in a world where a misplaced look could spark an accusation of treason, Jane's continued presence in the royal court speaks volumes about her uncanny ability to navigate lethal political currents. Yet beneath this facade of loyalty and competence, the psychological toll of her past choices gnawed at her relentlessly. For no matter how many queens she served or how many times she donned the veil of dutiful lady-in-waiting, the ghosts of Anne and George Boleyn lingered like specters in the flickering torchlight of royal corridors, reminding her that her own words might have sent them to their deaths. And as the years slipped by, Jane became a figure of both respect and suspicion among courtiers, admired for her intelligence and discretion, yet whispered about as a woman who had survived the purge that destroyed the Boleyns and who might, therefore, be capable of surviving anything, a notion that only increased her mystique and simultaneously placed her under a permanent cloud of quiet distrust. Because in Henry VIII's court, a woman who knew too much was always one rumor away from the scaffold, and Jane's ability to adjust her allegiances was tested anew with the arrival of Anne of Cleves, a foreign bride whose marriage to Henry VIII quickly dissolved into mutual embarrassment and annulment. Yet even amid that royal fiasco, Jane maintained her station, seamlessly shifting her support once more, demonstrating a political dexterity that true crime historians and Tudor scholars alike continue to marvel over. And though Anne of Cleves survived her marriage far better than Anne Boleyn, retreating into a comfortable life as the king's sister, Jane Boleyn's own life remained a delicate balancing act, her every step shadowed by the knowledge that one false move could resurrect the dark suspicions swirling around her name. And as Henry VIII turned his eyes toward his next queen, the youthful and vivacious Catherine Howard, Jane found herself drawn yet again into the intimate circles of a woman destined for catastrophe. But before that storm would break, Jane endured years of silent penance, carrying the weight of unspoken guilt, for the burden of knowing she had played a part in the destruction of her own family was a wound that never fully healed, manifesting in moments of intense private anguish and a kind of brittle composure that masked an inner torment. And although no records explicitly detail her private thoughts, the contours of her life paint a portrait of a woman haunted by trauma, forced to compartmentalize devastating memories, even as she performed her duties in the glittering yet deadly environment of Henry VIII's court, where the air itself seemed charged with secrets and the ever-present possibility of sudden arrest. For Jane, who had once navigated the delicate politics of Anne Boleyn's bedroom, now had to perform the same subtle dance under new queens, each reign a fresh minefield of loyalties and potential betrayals, and the court remained an arena where religious upheavals, sparked by Henry's break with Rome, only deepened the paranoia and suspicion, making Jane's continued survival all the more extraordinary, because the England of these years was not merely a kingdom, but a cauldron of ideological warfare, spies, informants, and ruthless ambition. And through it all, Jane maintained her precarious balance, even as memories of her husband George's final days in the Tower, the echoing hammer of the executioner's axe, and the sight of Anne Boleyn kneeling on the scaffold must have replayed endlessly in the darkness behind her eyes, reminding her that in Henry VIII's world, the past was never truly past, and the walls of the Tower of London held memories that could return to claim even those who thought themselves safe. And so it was that Jane Boleyn, carrying both the privileges of royal proximity and the curses of her knowledge, continued to tread carefully through a world of shifting alliances, knowing that with every royal marriage came new opportunities and new dangers, and that the smallest rumor could mean a return to the Tower where her family's blood still cried out from the stones. And as the fateful year of 1540 dawned and Catherine Howard stepped into the role of Queen, a fresh chapter opened in Jane's perilous story, one that would once again pull her into the vortex of a royal scandal, whose consequences would seal her fate and lead us into the darkest corridors of true crime history. By the time the year 1540 unfurled its icy mists across the grey stones of London, Jane Boleyn, whose life had already been etched deeply into the dark history of the Tudor court, found herself once again standing on the precipice of danger, as Henry VIII, restless and ravenous for both affection and political stability, set his sights on yet another young bride, the vibrant and breathtakingly youthful Catherine Howard, whose mere presence seemed to momentarily rekindle a spark of life in a king increasingly consumed by paranoia and the physical tolls of age. And as Jane, whose survival instincts had been sharpened to a lethal edge through years of navigating royal tempests, assumed her role as lady-in-waiting to this newest queen, she must have sensed both opportunity and peril swirling in the same perfumed air. For Catherine, unlike the politically astute Anne Boleyn or the pragmatic Anne of Cleves, was scarcely more than a girl, barely 20, intoxicated by courtly attentions, and dangerously reckless in ways that made her a glittering jewel in Henry's eyes, but a powder keg of royal scandal waiting to explode. And into this heady brew of youth, beauty, and reckless secrets stepped Jane Boleyn, older now, in her mid-30s, carrying the invisible scars of betrayal and blood, yet still sharp, observant, and determined to maintain her position within the lethal orbit of Tudor power. For in a court governed by Tudor history's merciless calculus, Jane understood that her value lay not merely in her service, but in her discretion and her willingness to perform the delicate, invisible tasks that bound queens to their ladies and shielded royal secrets from prying eyes. And it was perhaps this very combination of loyalty and quiet cunning that led Jane into the shadows of one of the most dangerous intrigues of Henry VIII's reign, as Catherine Howard, despite the glittering trappings of queenship, found herself unable, or perhaps unwilling, to sever ties with Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber, whose dashing presence and intimate proximity to the monarch placed him in a uniquely treacherous position. For in the Tudor court, where true crime history and royal politics were two faces of the same deadly coin, the discovery of a queen's adultery was not merely a personal betrayal, but a crime of high treason that threatened the very stability of the monarchy. And it was Jane Boleyn, with her practiced mastery of quiet corridors and hushed confidences, who became the linchpin in facilitating the clandestine meetings between Catherine and Culpeper, ensuring they could rendezvous in secret chambers, behind velvet curtains, and in darkened passages where the flicker of a single candle could mean exposure and death. and whether Jane's participation arose from genuine loyalty to Catherine, from fear of losing her precarious foothold in the royal household, or from the same dangerous curiosity that had once drawn her into the fatal drama of Anne Boleyn, remains a question historians continue to debate, fueling endless YouTube explorations into dark secrets and royal scandals, because the evidence suggests Jane was not merely a passive observer, but an active organizer, managing the logistics, timing, and cover stories necessary to shield the Queen's illicit romance from the relentless gaze of the court, and it is impossible to overstate the risk of such a role. For in Henry VIII's England, secrecy was both currency and curse, and Jane Boleyn, who had survived the lethal purge of the Boleyns, now found herself gambling her very life to protect the passions of a queen barely out of girlhood. And the meetings she arranged were nothing short of dangerous theater, with Catherine slipping from her chambers under pretense of illness or private prayer, while Jane kept watch, ears attuned to every footstep in the corridors, ready to intercept servants or suspicious guards, and one must imagine the pounding of her heart, the sheen of sweat along her temples, as she orchestrated moments that, if discovered, would ensure her head joined those of countless others upon Tower Hill. Yet Jane's calculation, perhaps born of years honing her survival instincts in the ruthless crucible of Tudor power, may have convinced her that securing Catherine's gratitude would protect her in the long run, making her indispensable to yet another queen. For such was the brutal logic of Henry VIII's court, where favors were traded like gold, and the closeness of a queen's confidence might spell salvation or doom. But as history would so cruelly demonstrate, even Jane Boleyn's skill could not conceal the blazing truth of Catherine Howard's indiscretions forever, for rumors began to leak from the shadows, whispers of the Queen's former lovers, including Francis Dereham, and suspicions that her heart and body might yet belong to another even after her royal marriage. And Henry, whose paranoia burned hotter with every passing year, began to take notice, unleashing his agents to probe the Queen's past with the same merciless thoroughness that had once destroyed Anne Boleyn. And as interrogations swept through the court, clawing secrets from servants and courtiers alike, Jane Boleyn's name inevitably surfaced, her role as confidant and facilitator making her a prime target for the king's fury. And in the icy weeks of late 1541, the storm finally broke, as Henry VIII's investigators assembled a damning web of testimony and confessions, weaving Jane's actions into a narrative of conspiracy and treason. And on a day that must have felt like the gates of hell swinging open, Jane Boleyn was seized from her quarters without warning, dragged from the glittering world of silks and ceremony into the iron jaws of royal justice, and carried off to the Tower of London, that ancient fortress where every stone seemed to echo with the ghosts of those who had walked its corridors only to die within its walls. And one can scarcely imagine the terror that must have seized her heart as the tower loomed into view. A dark monument to Tudor vengeance where she had once visited her husband and sister-in-law in their final days, never dreaming that she, too, would one day pass through those same gates as a prisoner condemned. And yet, even as she was locked away within its cold, unyielding walls, Jane Boleyn's mind must have raced with memories of George Boleyn's trial, Anne's doomed protests of innocence, and the deadly quiet that descended upon the court each time the executioner's axe fell. For now, it was her name whispered in fearful tones, her fate debated behind closed doors, and the very skills that had kept her alive for so long, her silence, her intelligence, her discretion, were rendered powerless in the face of a king determined to root out every last thread of betrayal. And so Jane Boleyn, once a mistress of courtly intrigue, found herself utterly vulnerable, swept into an investigation whose outcome had already been decided. For in Henry VIII's England, the mere suspicion of complicity in royal adultery was enough to guarantee a death sentence, and the charges laid against her were specific and damning. High treason for facilitating and concealing the Queen's adulterous liaisons, a crime punishable by the sword or the axe. And it is here, in the shadows of the tower, that Jane's story hurtles toward its most devastating chapters. For what happened next would not only seal her fate, but would shock the entire realm and change the very laws of England, leading us into the darkest corridors of Tudor history, where even madness could not save a woman from the wrath of a king determined to silence those who knew too much. In the bleak, unforgiving winter of late 1541, as snow gathered like silent witnesses on the battlements of the Tower of London, and the Thames flowed black and cold beneath the shadow of traitors' heads impaled on spikes, Jane Boleyn's life entered a descent so harrowing that even the hardened men of Henry VIII's royal guard reportedly shuddered to witness it. For though she had once maneuvered the glittering labyrinth of the Tudor court with breathtaking dexterity, the fortress that had claimed her husband George Boleyn and her sister-in-law Anne Boleyn now became her own prison, its damp stone walls closing around her like the iron jaws of fate. And it was within those walls, where so many royal secrets had been whispered and silenced forever, that Jane's mind began to fracture under a weight of terror, guilt, and the crushing certainty that her life was about to end beneath the blade. And contemporary accounts paint a picture as chilling as anything found in the annals of dark history or true crime history. For within mere days of her imprisonment, Jane Boleyn reportedly slipped into a state of complete mental collapse, her speech turning to fragmented mutterings, her eyes wild with visions only she could see, as she screamed at shadows and clawed at the unyielding stones as if seeking escape into the very fabric of the tower itself. And to those who witnessed her unraveling, there could be no doubt that Jane had succumbed entirely to madness, a fate tragically common among prisoners of the tower, yet in her case made all the more cruel by the echoing memories of the loved ones she had watched perish in the same place, and those centuries of English common law dating back to the reign of Edward III had firmly established the precedent that no person judged insane could be executed, a principle rooted in Christian mercy, and the idea that divine law forbade taking the life of one who could not comprehend their crime. Henry VIII, in perhaps the most chilling act of his reign, chose to see Jane's mental collapse not as an obstacle, but as an inconvenience to be swept aside. And so began one of the most brazen manipulations of English law ever recorded, a moment so unprecedented that historians still point to it as a defining example of how absolute power can twist justice itself into a weapon of vengeance. For rather than wait to see if Jane might recover her sanity, the king set into motion a legal maneuver that would shatter 2 centuries of jurisprudence, ordering Parliament to draft an Act of Attainder so specifically tailored that its very language seemed to drip with royal spite, declaring that henceforth no person convicted or attainted of high treason should be spared execution on account of madness or lunacy. And in this ruthless decree, Henry VIII transformed what had once been a bedrock of mercy in English law into an instrument of lethal precision, ensuring that the woman whose knowledge of royal scandals and hidden court intrigues posed a lingering threat could be silenced permanently. And the speed with which this act was pushed through Parliament was itself an act of tyranny cloaked in legislative form, taking less than 2 weeks from conception to royal assent, leaving even the king's most loyal advisors, including Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, deeply unsettled, for Cranmer and others recognized that executing the insane violated not only the legal traditions of England, but the moral fabric of Christian belief, where the insane were viewed as souls under God's special protection, incapable of moral or legal responsibility. Yet in Henry VIII's England, royal will eclipsed both law and conscience, and thus Jane Boleyn became the central figure in a legal and moral revolution whose dark implications still echo through the corridors of British legal history. For her fate signaled to all who watched that in the realm of Henry VIII, no principle was sacred, no precedent unbreakable, and even madness itself offered no shield from royal wrath. And as the Act of Attainder passed with ruthless efficiency, stripping Jane of titles, lands, and any hope of salvation, foreign courts across Europe erupted in condemnation, with the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope themselves decrying the king's actions as barbaric, unchristian, and an affront to civilized governance and diplomatic relations, already strained by Henry's break with Rome, and the fallout of his marital machinations, grew even colder. For Jane's plight became a symbol of royal tyranny wielded without restraint, a warning to all who might dare oppose Henry VIII or possess knowledge capable of undermining his carefully constructed image of supreme authority. And in the frigid cells of the Tower, Jane Boleyn drifted in and out of lucidity, at times babbling incoherently about ghosts and royal conspiracies, at other times falling silent for hours, staring into the darkness with eyes that seemed to hold secrets too terrible to speak, and the guards who attended her, Seasoned men, accustomed to the moans and prayers of the condemned, reportedly whispered among themselves that even they had never seen a prisoner unravel so completely. Yet amidst this chaos of a shattered mind, a tragic irony unfolded. For Jane Boleyn's final days in the Tower were marked by fleeting moments of clarity, periods in which she reportedly regained enough composure to speak of her past, her regrets, and the crushing guilt of having helped bring about the deaths of Anne Boleyn and George Boleyn, her voice trembling with emotion as she asked whether she would be granted the mercy of confession and absolution before her execution, a request that, under any previous monarch, would have at least postponed her sentence until she was deemed sane enough to understand her fate. But under Henry VIII, even this final act of Christian mercy was denied, as the king, convinced that Jane's madness was a cunning ruse to evade justice, pressed forward relentlessly with his plan to see her executed. And it is here that the true horror of Jane's story reaches its zenith, for she was not merely another victim of the king's paranoia, but the living embodiment of a legal principle overturned to serve royal vengeance, a woman whose mind had shattered beneath the weight of secrets, grief, and terror, yet whose life was deemed forfeit regardless of her ability to comprehend the blade awaiting her. And the Tower itself seemed to conspire against her sanity, its narrow corridors and echoing chambers reminding her at every turn of George's imprisonment, Anne's execution, and the countless whispers of betrayal and blood that haunted those ancient stones. And one cannot help but wonder whether in her moments of lucidity, Jane understood that she was to become the first woman in English history executed despite a proven mental collapse, an infamy that would stain the pages of Tudor history forever. For the very idea that Henry VIII could command Parliament to rewrite centuries of law for the singular purpose of extinguishing her life speaks volumes about the extent of his absolute power and the terror he inspired in those who served him. And as Jane awaited the inevitable summons to Tower Green, the stage was set for one of the most chilling finales in true crime history, an execution not only of a woman, but of a legal safeguard that had protected the vulnerable for generations. And as we turn now toward the final hours of Jane Boleyn's life, we must brace ourselves for the grim spectacle of a mind shattered, a crown consumed by vengeance, and a kingdom forced to witness how far Henry VIII would go to protect his secrets and silence those who knew too much. As dawn broke cold and pale over the Tower of London on February 13, 1542, the very fortress that had swallowed so many whispers of royal secrets and soaked its stones in the blood of traitors, seemed to hold its breath for what was about to unfold. For this was the day Jane Boleyn, Vic Countess Rowford, once a woman of piercing intelligence and courtly grace, would walk to her death on Tower Green, the same patch of earth where 6 years earlier, Anne Boleyn, her own sister-in-law, had met her fate beneath the executioner's blade. And though Jane had spent months in the Tower lost in the labyrinth of her own shattered mind, babbling visions and clawing at the walls, on this final morning, fate dealt a cruel twist. For witnesses would later report that she awoke with a sudden and eerie lucidity, her eyes clear, her speech coherent, as if some divine or devilish force had lifted the veil of madness just long enough for her to fully comprehend the horror of what lay ahead. And in those solemn hours before the axe, Jane was permitted, as was her right as a noblewoman, to dress in garments befitting her rank, layers of fine cloth draped around a body weakened by months of imprisonment. A macabre reminder that even in the rituals of death, the hierarchy of the Tudor court held sway, and as she stepped into the pale winter light, flanked by guards and clergy, her figure seemed at once regal and ghost-like, each step echoing through the silent courtyards, as if the Tower itself remembered the footsteps of Anne Boleyn before her. And though she had once been a woman whose eyes missed nothing and whose mind had outmaneuvered the shifting politics of 4 queens, Jane Boleyn now faced her end with a composure that stunned those assembled, delivering a final speech on the scaffold in the time-honored format expected of condemned nobles, acknowledging her guilt, though whether she truly believed herself guilty remains one of the haunting mysteries of Tudor history, and offering prayers for King Henry VIII, the very monarch who had rewritten the laws of England, just to see her life extinguished. And there, beneath the cold sky and in full view of a select gathering of courtiers and Tower officials, the headsman raised his axe, bringing it down with a single practiced stroke that severed the last fragile thread connecting Jane Boleyn to a world she had navigated for nearly 2 decades with both brilliance and fatal miscalculation. And her blood spilled onto the stones that already bore the silent testimony of countless others, creating an indelible stain upon the dark history of Henry VIII's reign. And after her execution, Jane's body was interred within the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula, nestled amid the remains of Anne Boleyn and George Boleyn, forming in death the grim family reunion that fate and royal vengeance had so mercilessly denied them in life. And though no elaborate monument marked her grave, the very presence of her bones alongside those of her kin stands as a silent chronicle of a dynasty obliterated by the same king who had once elevated them to dazzling heights. And in the days and weeks following Jane's execution, an eerie silence fell over the Tudor court, for unlike other high-profile deaths that fueled gossip and courtly intrigue, hers was spoken of in hushed tones or not at all, as though even Henry's loyal courtiers sensed that in killing a woman whose mind had broken, the king had crossed a line that history could neither forgive nor fully comprehend. And the legacy of Jane Boleyn's death would ripple far beyond her grave, sending tremors through the legal principles of England, and leaving behind a precedent so dangerous that legal scholars and true crime historians continue to study it centuries later. Because by changing the law to allow the execution of the insane, Henry VIII not only extinguished a single life, but struck at the very foundation of justice itself, proving that in the shadowy world of Tudor power, no one, not even a mind fractured by despair, was safe from the king's wrath. And as we stand now on the threshold of history's judgment, we must ask ourselves whether Jane Boleyn was the architect of her own destruction, or merely the final casualty of a monarch whose paranoia devoured both friend and foe, a question that lingers like an echo through the tower's cold corridors, leading us inevitably into the reckoning of her legacy and the enduring shadows she cast upon the chronicles of dark history. In the end, the story of Jane Boleyn stands not merely as another bloody chapter in Tudor history, but as a haunting testament to how absolute power can warp justice, corrode mercy, and turn even the fragile sanctuary of a shattered mind into a battlefield for royal vengeance. For in a world ruled by Henry VIII, a king whose name is forever intertwined with royal scandal, dark history, and the chilling echoes of true crime history, Jane Boleyn's fate exposes a timeless truth that resonates far beyond the stones of the Tower of London. That knowledge can be as deadly as any blade, that survival in a court fueled by secrets demands sacrifices so terrible they can break the strongest mind, and that sometimes the price of knowing too much is not merely your life, but the rewriting of law itself. And as we stand centuries removed from the roar of the crowds and the swing of the executioner's axe, we are left to wrestle with a single, unsettling question. Was Jane Boleyn a cunning player who betrayed those closest to her for a chance to live another day? Or was she the ultimate victim, consumed by forces far greater and more ruthless than any mortal soul could endure? And perhaps the answer lies somewhere in the shadows between guilt and survival, between loyalty and treachery, reminding us that history is rarely as black and white as the ink that records it. And as we close the book on Jane Boleyn's life, a life woven into the darkest corridors of Tudor intrigue, we must also confront the warning she leaves us, that unchecked power can bend laws, silence truth, and destroy even the most protected among us. And if you've felt the chill of this tale, if you've wondered what secrets still lie buried in the tower's cold stones, then I invite you to join the conversation. Tell me in the comments, was Jane Boleyn a traitor or a tragic survivor? And don't forget to like this video, save it to your Dark History playlist, and hit subscribe for more royal secrets and deadly twists from the shadows of the past, because the next story might just change everything you thought you knew about power, betrayal, and the razor-thin line between survival and destruction.